Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be talking about chapter 16 of Anatomy and Physiology about blood. Now, this is a very diverse topic because it is so elaborative, and I just want you guys to know that it's very easy if you know the simple facts and you will know exactly where you're headed in that direction of comprehending all the important terms and things like that. So I want to start off with red blood cells. Now, red blood cells are known as erythrocytes. Then we also have white blood cells, which are known as leukocytes. And then platelets are known as thrombocytes. So there are many things that you want to know about each one of these. And I cannot stress enough how many different processes are so important through all of these. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that we want to know are what are the functions of red blood cells? Why do we have them? Why do we need them? And what are the things that could go wrong of not taking care of ourselves? So basically, I have my little notebook right here just to have some little key points of what you guys should know that's important. So the main thing about the function of red blood cells is distribution. Distribution is what is going all around the whole body. And so that can be substances, that could be our blood, that can be ions, water. That's so important. And so distribution is important. Regulation is the second thing. Regulation is important for our body temperature to maintain homeostasis. If we are too cold all the time or too hot, that could be something with our blood. Like, I know an example would be like some people that have iron deficiency anemia. That's something that maybe can cause people to just have a little lower than normal body temperature, which makes them really cold sometimes because we don't have enough hemoglobin and iron and oxygen to just supply our body to be like normal, which is homeostasis. So function normal. Protection against blood loss. What if we have a wound or even a paper cut and it just doesn't stop? We want our body to defend that and handle that in a very, I don't know how, our body is capable of making all of these functions so elaborative and so microscopically important. So we want platelets to just come there and save that whole thing from penetrating to outside the body and stuff like that. Protection as well against infection. Infection is something very important. We never want to give blood to someone that, unintentionally, because that does cause, those are one of our body fluids, and that does cause infection and stuff like that. So, what is blood made of? So, blood is actually made of fluid connective tissue. Fluid connective tissue simply means that it's a liquid connective tissue. Blood has a pH value of 7.35 to 7.45. It's a little bit more dense than water because water does have a neutral pH, but it's just because it has a thicker viscosity and stuff like that. And there's also several factors that can interfere with that, such as, are we hydrated, dehydrated, and things like that. Now, in blood, if you were to take a blood sample, into a centrifuge and spin it, all the components would separate. And the way those components would separate would be divided in between plasma, the red blood cells, which are going to be right at the bottom, and about 1% of that is going to be white blood cells. So our red blood cells in this tube, if we were to spin a centrifuge, would be right at the bottom, which would account for 45%. And then at the very, very top, following that, would be 55% of just plasma. Plasma is actually 90% water. The other 10% is consisted of proteins, so it's going to be like albumins or something like that, globulins, and fibrinogens. And so those are very important for other reasons. And the other 10%, part of that 1% is white blood cells. So plasma is also less dense than blood, so red blood cells, and red blood cells are just going to take the win for being more dense than plasma and being more dense than water. Another thing about red blood cells is that they are non-living cells, so they do not divide. They also don't have a nucleus. They don't even have organelles. They don't have mitochondria or anything like that. And white blood cells are the only ones that actually are true cells because they do have a nucleus inside, which we will explain later as to what exactly that is. And platelets aren't true cells either because those are just little fragments of blood that go into the clotting process. So another thing is that blood actually originates in the bone marrow, so it's all made in the bone marrow and things like that. And so there are 3 stages of actually how that is made. The first stage is the yolk stage, which happens around the 3rd week to the 2nd month of an embryo. So when a pregnant woman is having a baby, all that red blood cells and stuff that's actually coming from the mother is supplying for the baby that's being made, and that is the yolk stage. The second stage is the hepatic stage, and the hepatic stage is going to take from that 2nd month to birth. So from birth, all of those red blood cells are going to be made in the liver because our body does not have that red bone marrow specifically made yet, and our body's not developed yet enough to supply all of that. But then after birth, the 5th month to your death, that is called the myeloid stage. Myeloid is also an important form for myeloid stem cells. And myeloid stem cells are simply where that's going to take place in the red bone marrow. So all red blood cells start off as a hemocytoblast, and that is the same thing for red blood cells except B and T cells. Actually, no. Yeah, they all start off as a hemocytoblast, but it's divided into 2 that then makes the B and T cells differentiated. So at the top of the pyramid is going to be the hemocytoblast. Then it's going to divide into 2 parts. It's going to be the myeloid stem cell, and then it's going to be the lymphoid stem cell. That lymphoid stem cell is always going to be just B and T cells. And those are just B and T lymphocytes, which are important for immune responses. And then we go to the myeloid stem cell. In that myeloid stem cell, that is where red blood cells are going to be made, megakaryotes, which are platelets, eosinophils, neutrophils, basophils, and all those other things, even monocytes, which then turn into macrophages. So there are certain growth factors that are important that take place when we are looking at certain chemicals of how blood is actually made and what are the signals that are going to respond to that. And that first one for red blood cells is going to be erythropoietin, also known as EPO. The second one for white blood cells is going to be leukopoietin for white blood cells. And the third one for platelets is going to be thrombopoietin. And those are all very important. Those are just the growth factors that are going to be little chemical messengers to initiate, hematopoiesis, leukopoiesis, all that stuff. So thrombopoiesis, so yeah. For erythrocytes, the main thing that you want to know is the shape of them. So the reason why they have this little biconcave disc, so they're they're round, they have this little like curve, and then they have like a dip in the middle. That is important and sufficient for surface area. So then all that blood is reaching through those capillaries in the bloodstream and giving it its very flexible viscosity and things like that. Another thing that's very important is gas exchange and gas transport. So we have hemoglobin, which also stands for HB, and that is very important for gas transport because hemoglobin is the one that synthesizes that. If we don't have enough oxygen in our red blood cells, then we can get homeostatic imbalances or erythrocyte disorders like anemias and stuff like that. So we don't consume the red blood cells don't consume oxygen, they actually transport it. So for example, in cellular respiration, oxygen is the last terminal acceptor and things like that. And so just little things like that are important, but they do not consume oxygen. My voice came off. All right. So hemoglobin, what does that mean? Well, heme is what stands for when there is, well, it stands for the pigment, but when there is a lot of oxygen, then it would have this ruby red color, very nice and pretty. And then when there's not enough oxygen, it would have that little dark cherry color, and that's not good. The iron is what gives it that color as well, and that's very important. For one hemoglobin molecule, it's going to make 4 oxygen molecules, and globin, since I broke it down, globin stands for 4 polypeptide chains. 2 are going to be alpha, and then the other two are going to be beta. So also, the way that people measure blood in our body, they use a hematocrit. A hematocrit is just literally the average of our blood volume in our body. So for males, they have a 47% plus or minus 5%, and then for females, we have a 42% plus or minus 5%. And for hemoglobin as well, in males, we have, I'm pretty sure, around 13 to 18 grams of hemoglobin per milliliter, and then for females, it's 12 to 16 grams over milliliters. Okay. So, like we said, all red blood cells and white blood cells are made and platelets are made in that bone marrow. Whatever's not made in that bone marrow is just B and T cells, and those are lymphocytes. So, how does this all happen? This is very important. So, the stages of erythropoiesis, which is also known as red blood cell poiesis, is important because it takes around 15 days for just one blood cell to make. They do not divide or anything like that. So the way that this happens is that, there's the hemocytoblast that we have, which then turns into a pro-erythroblast, then it turns into a basophilic erythroblast, and that is basically going to build and divide, all those ribosomes and things like that, because those are very important for our body. And yeah, so then it turns into an orthochromatic erythroblast, and that simply means that that hemoglobin is being made, and then it turns into a reticulocyte, and after the reticulocyte it's turned into the actual erythrocyte. So yeah, and then the way that this happens is very complicated, but we have around 7.2 million red blood cells made per second in our body. So we can never run out of blood unless we physically run out of blood. And when we don't have enough red blood cells, it's known as tissue hypoxia. And hypoxia means that when there's a low oxygenation of red blood cells, then the body is going to stimulate EPO to then make the red blood cells. If we have many red blood cells, then that's going to increase the viscosity, but slow down the speed, I guess, through the bloodstream of red blood cells, things like that. So, we have the balance of red blood cell production, and the destruction also depends on it as well. Since they're not dividing, how are they eventually gone after 15 days? Well, that is known as the destruction of them, because the hemoglobin just separates and then it goes into different areas of the body, and we will talk about that. And there's also the hormonal controls that are part of everything that is important for the production and destruction of them. And then there's the dietary requirements. So, for homeostasis of normal oxygen levels in our body for hematopoiesis, is the first thing is that we're going to have a stimulus. So that stimulus is going to be hypoxia. So hypoxia, we said, that is a low oxygenation due to either, it can be low oxygenation, it can be a low hemoglobin level, or even a low red blood cell count. That is what I got right here. Then the kidney is going to release that erythropoietin, EPO, and then it targets the bone marrow. After it targets the bone marrow, EPO is then going to stimulate that bone marrow, and then it's going to produce and increase that red blood cell count, and therefore that oxygen is then going to be carried out by the blood, which then creates a negative feedback loop. And that is how homeostasis is going to be maintained. A lot of people also abuse EPO because it's specifically for athletes, and then we can talk about that, and that's also known as blood doping. So, another cause of how does hypoxia happen? Well, hypoxia can happen when there is a low red blood cell count, and this can be due to a hemorrhage or a high destruction of red blood cells. There's also going to be iron deficiencies. Like we had iron deficiencies can also mean that there's low hemoglobin. Low hemoglobin would then mean that there's a low oxygenation, and then that low oxygenation can also be part of a factor of being in high altitudes. When you're on your plane, where you're in the mountains, things like that are very important. Or even when you move somewhere, you're not accustomed to that. Yeah. Another thing that we need for EPO to even produce in our body are these nutrients, and one of them is vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 is and folic acid are very important because they're important for DNA synthesis, and vitamin B12 is absorbed by the intrinsic factor in our intestines. And so if our intrinsic factor cannot absorb that vitamin B12, then some people get vitamin B12 injections, and that condition will be spoken about soon. And also 65% of EPO production is from hemoglobin, so you need iron. So the destruction of red blood cells, well, it takes 15 days to make them, and then they last in your body for 120 days. But how are then they destroyed after 120 days each? So the old red blood cells become fragile, and that hemoglobin begins to degenerate. And so that hemoglobin is just going to be separated into its main portions, two whatever, I forgot the word. So the heme, which is the pigment, is going to turn into, it's going to be excreted out. So so we actually get small percentages of iron that's excreted out through our digestive system and urinary system. but then that iron is also salvaged for reuse. And so it also turns yellow into bilirubin, which is secreted by the liver into bile into the intestines. And then the globin is just going to be turned straight into amino acids, so that is just going to work for a protein synthesis. So, one thing that I want to talk about is just the erythrocytes disorders, which is probably the last thing, and blood doping. So, erythrocyte disorders, one of the most important ones are anemia. Anemia simply means that when there is a low red blood cell count or a low hemoglobin. And this is actually a sign of disorder because the blood has an abnormal oxygen carrying capacity, and it can't support normal metabolism. This is a metabolic imbalance, and it's also homeostatic because of these reasons that I will talk. So people that have anemia are usually going to be fatigued, they're going to have chills, they're also going to have this intense shortness of breath, meaning that they have to catch enough air to actually support their life functions, talking, daily tasks, and things like that. So the first one that I have is hemorrhagic anemia. Now, this is an acute anemia, meaning that it happens quickly. So this can be from a stab wound, a large cut, anything like that. Or it can also be due to menstrual bleeding or an ulcer. So if we have some bleeding in the esophagus, that is known as an ulcer. And so chronic hemorrhagic anemia is a bleeding ulcer, and that is not good. Another way that you will know that you have a bleeding ulcer is if in your feces you have seen like coffee grounds, or if you are if you throw up or something like that and you just see like, I guess, coffee grounds as well, because it's just deoxygenated blood and stuff like that. So when you have another thing, number 2, is a low red blood cell count, and this is like the main portion of anemia. So when you have that low red blood cell count without any stab wounds, without anything, the first one is iron deficiency anemia. So this is caused by either hemorrhagic anemia, a low iron intake, and basically, or you have an impaired absorption, meaning that you just lack a lot of nutrients. So a lot of people get iron supplements to just, if you don't like meat, then you can eat like spinach. Spinach has a lot of iron in it. That is something that I do. And then pernicious anemia is actually an autoimmune disorder, and it's very common in the elderly. And this is a lack and a failure absorption of vitamin B12 because that intrinsic factor can absorb vitamin B12. So people get vitamin B injections and things like that. Renal anemia is a lack of EPO. We already know what we need EPO for. So some people are treated with synthetic EPO. And then aplastic anemia is the destruction and inhibition of the red bone marrow. So meaning that all the cells just really can't function as red blood cells. And this is due to people that take a lot of drugs, things like that, because that bone marrow is so destroyed that it really can't even do its job anymore. If there's a high red blood cell destruction, it's also known as hemolytic anemia. And hemolytic anemia simply means that these premature red blood cells are lysing so fast that this is caused by hemoglobin abnormalities, infections, but it's also usually genetic. So that is very important. 2 more things is thalassemias. This is another genetic disorder. It's very common in Mediterranean people. And basically what happens is one globin chain is altered and it's absent. So this is coming from someone that is autosomal recessive and things like that. And then sickle cell anemia, we know that it comes from African American people, and basically these their red blood cells have this half moon shape, which causes a lot of pain because they're not in that biconcave disc shape, and it's very sad, and it usually takes 10 to 12 days of them just circulating in the body instead of 120 days. So a lot of people, also what happens is that instead of the chain being from glutamate or something like that, it's exchanged into valine or something like that. And so one amino acid chain is wrong, and the global beta chain. And this is just poor oxygen delivery, and it just causes pain, like I said. And the last thing that I wanted to talk to is about blood doping. And we know that blood doping is this artificially induced polycythemia, and this is just excess red blood cells that are being, inside the body, because people use them for marathons. A lot of athletes use this synthetically, and it's not very good. Even in anabolic steroids, testosterone, things like that, people just use it just to, increase their oxygen carrying capacity so that they can run forever and go to the finish line. So that is basically it for everything. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video and learned a lot. Please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you want any more videos of anything specifically. So yeah, bye.